First, she came with a suitcase. First, she laughed at my jokes like we had not grown apart. First, she said she needed a place to reset. I made coffee. She accepted it like a treaty. She crossed the threshold with a manner that assumed permission. She unpacked like she belonged. She left a pair of shoes by our door the way a claim is left on a map. At first it was small things. A towel in the master bathroom. A shampoo on the sink. A toothbrush that looked like mine but belonged to her. She said thanks, and her voice had a softness I didn't know how to answer. My husband smiled when she walked into a room. He smiled the way someone smiles when remembering a private joke. He smiled the way he used to smile at me at the very beginning, but with a shadow at the edge. I cataloged the changes. I kept lists the way someone keeps a ledger. Late replies. Closed laptops. Invitations he would forget. She stayed later than she said. She cooked our meals with the confidence of someone who knows which fork belongs where. She rearranged cushions as if she were composing a photograph. There were messages. Her phone lit up across the kitchen table, and I watched expressions shift like weather. His laughter sometimes came after he read something, and then he would tuck his phone away. I did not open her messages. I am not that person. I did not have to be. We are people who learn to live inside other people's choices. We fit our days around their edges. I continued with my life because not everything is urgent the moment your heart feels it. I watered the plant on the windowsill. I paid the bills. I made an appointment with my dentist. Routine is a kind of defense. She called me by the old pet name I had stopped using in public. She called him by a name only he and I had used when we were foolish and young. She told stories about our childhood in a way that gilded certain memories and omitted others. Storytelling is selection. She made herself into the version of herself that fit best into our family portrait. I found a lipstick stain on his collar. It was the color she favored. I stained a napkin with the memory and put it in a drawer. I did not accuse. Accusation is a leap. I needed a bridge. There were nights when the house rearranged itself around their presence. Laughter from the kitchen like a radio tuned to a station I did not recognize. A mug left with the lipstick ring. A song on low volume that I did not mind. He would ask me about my day with his hand on my back. He would kiss my forehead in that careful way of someone trying not to be discovered doing the wrong thing. It is easy to make stories out of small things. It is easy to stitch them into a tapestry of betrayal. I could have become the woman in those stories overnight. But there is a patience that comes from long marriage. You learn to measure reaction against consequence. You learn that the loudest thunder is not always the storm you will survive. I started to watch the patterns. He would go out for work and come back late smelling of her perfume. He would send messages and then answer them with the quickness of someone practiced at concealment. I listened to the silence between his sentences the way one listens for footsteps in an empty house. She told me once that she had always admired him. She said it in the way people say dangerous things when they are half drunk on the comfort of a sofa. He's so steady, she said. He makes me feel safe. She did not know how well I knew loose edges. She did not know the times he had been unsteady and I had held him. I began to gather. Not out of rage. Not out of vindictiveness. Out of the need to see the seams. I took screenshots when phones lay unattended. I wrote down times. I kept receipts in a shoebox, the way one keeps small confessions. I recorded the tone of his laughter and the way it changed when she was in the room. I recorded my own pulse. I recorded the way the walls of our home listened. She called me sensitive, as if sensitivity were a fault. She said I worried too much. She said I took small things and made them into scenes. Maybe she was right. But sometimes scenes are the only form a truth will take until someone with scissors cuts through the cloth. He left his laptop unlocked once. It was an improbable, careless kindness. She was in the next room. The screen glowed blue with fragments of messages that glinted like fish scales. There was a line of text that made my stomach drop. He had written something like, "If you leave, I'll come with you." The conditional pain of that sentence. I did not read everything at once. I read just enough. Enough to know the direction of the wind. She texted in the language of seduction and of small conspiracies. He replied with restraint and then with warmth. There were confessions, and then there were corrections. There were plans to meet for coffee that became later for dinner. There were promises that evaporated into lighter words. I saved a voice note that made me feel like an intruder in my own life. She said his name like a pet name, and then laughed. She described a future made for two during a night when the house slept. She did not know I had heard it. She did not know that sometimes the truth arrives with a sound you cannot unhear. I could have left the recordings on the shelf like a loaded gun. I could have detonated them in a public place. I could have broken them into shards and spilled them on the table. Instead, I made a folder and named it with a date. I labeled it in the way people label grief when they have time to be careful. There is a strange grace in restraint, a violence in spectacle. I held back. I watched them. I watched how she smoothed the bedsheets at night. I watched how he adjusted the collar of his shirt when she left the room. She started to take long baths. She left candles burning in the bathroom like little signals. She sang under the water sometimes, and the sound carried into the hallways. Once she asked me to borrow my dress for an evening, and I said no. "Why?" she said, surprised, as if the denial were a mirror she did not recognize. He began to call less frequently when he was away. When he did call, his voice hesitated at the edges. He would say, "Everything's fine," and then recount minute details as if to prove it. He would call me love in that mechanical way of someone practicing affection. I learned to hear those rehearsed syllables and know where they landed. The days folded into each other. There were dinners with 3 chairs. There were mornings when the sunlight convinced me it could make anything whole again. I reminded myself that marriages survive on small mercies. I tried to inventory those mercies like a steward counting linens. She sent him a framed photograph of the two of them at a party. He hung it in the study where I could see it on the corner of late afternoons. It was a small defacement, and my eyes learned its angles. He would pass by it and not touch it. He would sit across from me and speak of the weather as if that were where we built our future. I began to imagine scenarios. The mind is generous with scenes. It made a dozen plays where I was the woman who storms in and rips the photograph off the wall. It wrote me as a heroine. But I had no appetite for dramatics. I preferred slow work, asking questions that felt like soft chisels. One night I found them both awake in the kitchen. She was standing by the counter stirring tea. He was at the sink staring into the cold glass of the window. They spoke quietly about a trip she wanted to take. She braided the silence with small enthusiasm. I stood in the doorway like something the house had forgotten to build. The secret is always a shape, before it is a sentence. A silence that carries more than an explanation will. I knew things no one had asked me to know. I had kept evidence the way a librarian keeps rare books, catalogued, preserved, out of sight. I had not told him I had kept it. I had not told myself why I kept it. Then, one rainy afternoon, the house did a small thing that changed everything. The electricity flickered. His laptop, left on the table, rebooted and the background image shifted. In that bright, accidental moment, a file revealed itself on the desktop. Its name was a date I recognized only because I had a copy with the same digits. I felt the word secret move like a bird in my chest. He walked in then, his hair still damp from the rain. He caught my eye on the open file. There was no frantic guilt in his expression. There was a tiredness that belonged to someone who had been awake for other people's reasons. He said simply, "We need to talk." The house held its breath like a room waiting for applause. I showed him what I had. I put the shoebox on the table and slid the napkin, the screenshots, the voice note across like cards on a green felt table. He looked at each piece with the slowness of someone who reads a map of a country he loved and now finds borders changed. He did not deny. He did not sharpen his voice into defense. He folded his hands as if he were reading aloud to himself. He then told me something I did not expect. He told me that he had been aware. He told me he had been careful. He told me, with a voice that trembled only at the edges, that he had been recording. He had recordings of conversations with her. He had recordings of confessions. He had copies of messages he had saved, not to destroy us, but to protect us. She had not known. She had not known that in the small, careful hours when she thought she was alone with a willing partner, there were devices quietly listening. She had not known that what she believed to be private had been, for months, catalogued. The room was a ledger open to a page. He slid his phone across to me. The files were there, neat as coins. There was a silence that was not empty. It was full of consequences settling like dust. He said, "I never wanted to hurt you." He said, "I didn't know how to be honest without losing everything." He said, "I left the recording because I needed to know where my own heart stood before I made a terrible mistake." The words were small bridges. She walked in as he spoke. She had the careless brightness of someone who has not yet counted the cost of something she has wished for. She noticed the phone. Her face shifted. The photograph on the wall seemed to tilt. He looked at her, and then at me, and then back at her again, as if trying to read the same page in two languages. She did not know the file names. She did not know what the dates meant. She did not know that a ledger had been kept. She asked, "What's wrong?" with the sincere alarm of a child who has been interrupted. He said, "We need to talk." And the voice was the one that breaks the surface of a lake, the first ripple before the waves. I watched her gather herself with the economy of someone who believes confrontation is the only theater that matters. She sat. She folded her hands. She asked if she had done anything wrong. There is a peculiar moment in these scenes when the instigator becomes the accused, and the world tilts and waits to see where gravity will land. We listened to the recordings. We played voice notes where she spoke of plans and left spaces for future dates that would never come. We played messages where he hesitated and then amended his words. Listening to your life as though it were a file is strange. You hear the cracks you have made in it and the places you have smoothed. She cried when the evidence was shown. She said she had not meant to hurt me. She said she had loved him as if loving were a right. Love is not a claim you make at someone else's table. It is not a trophy you pick up when no one is looking. He apologized in a way that was blunt and careful. He said, "I thought about leaving." He said, "I was afraid of the hurt my leaving would cause you." He said, "But I also knew I had to know where my heart lived." It is an odd mercy to hear someone explain the architecture of their cowardice. The secret, then, was not that he had been unfaithful in the way people imagine. The secret was that he had been honest enough to document his doubt. He did not know how to ask for help. He did not know how to say, "I am lost," without falling. So he made recordings as a kind of scaffolding. He built a structure he could step back from and examine before he chose to step forward. She had not known any of that. She had assumed that love was a simple arithmetic. Desire plus opportunity equals union. She had not understood the geometries of commitment. She had not known that inside his hesitations there were old debts and promises and a loyalty that bent but did not break. I did not become a stranger that day. I did become a steward of what remained. I placed the recordings back into the shoebox. I did not storm out. I did not throw away the photograph. I made coffee. I sat down at the table. There are people who expect melodrama. There are others who know that life repairs itself in small stitches. We spoke for hours. We named things like surgeons naming organs. She said she had been lonely. He said he needed to feel sure before he acted. I said I wanted to know why my house had felt like a room with a window open to another world. We made decisions that were not triumphant. We made them with the weary gravity of people who have already had enough of the theater of love. She agreed to move out. He agreed to seek help for the ways he had drifted. I agreed to speak more when my body asked me to speak. None of these are fireworks. They are, rather, the slow lights that guide a house back to its center. The secret had saved us not by preventing pain, but by making the pain legible. It is easier to heal when you can name the wound. He had been ashamed. He had been frightened. He had been human in the messy way people are when their inner maps do not match their outward plots. He had also kept a ledger because he cared enough to mark his own wrong turns. She left with a box and a promise that she would go to therapy. She left with the grace of someone who realized she had overreached. She apologized in ways that were not enough and also were the only things she had. We did not speak for a long time after that. The silence was heavy with repair work. It was not the absence of sound so much as the presence of surgery. We started to put things back in order. The photograph moved from the study to a drawer. He began to sleep with the window closed. I unlocked my phone in front of him sometimes. We learned to name the small betrayals we had tolerated until they felt innocuous. We learned to be precise with our apologies. There is no clean ending to this story. There is only a continuous accounting of what we owe each other now that truth has been taken out of pockets and laid on the table. The secret remained in the shoebox for a while. Sometimes I would open it and feel the weight of the files like a small, awkward mercy. I would remember that almost everything worth keeping has a cost. People ask for revenge in these stories as if vengeance is the natural punctuation. They do not ask for the quieter thing, restoration. Restoration is not a single dramatic act. It is the daily choice to speak when silence would be easier. It is the choice to put down the photograph and not pick it up. It is the choice to answer when asked, "Are you okay?" with the truth. Months passed. The moon cycled through its usual phases. The house learned new habits. He learned to text me when he would be late. I learned to say, "I am worried," rather than storing the worry like old coins. She called sometimes to ask about small domestic things. She asked, awkwardly, about recipes. She thanked me once for a bowl I had kept for her. There are nights when I still replay the sound of her voice on a recording. I do not listen to it for proof. I listen to it because the past is not a thing that disappears. It is a room you return to and sometimes clean. Cleaning does not erase stains. It simply makes them less sharp. The one secret changed the story, but did not solve all equations. It taught us that people are terrible at asking for help and brilliant at inventing reasons to avoid it. It taught us that sometimes the person you think is betraying you is also betraying themselves. And it taught us that evidence, when placed between two people who love each other, can be a tool for repair rather than a weapon for war. I kept the shoebox for a long time after. I could have destroyed it. I could have burned it and scattered the ashes on a windy day and told myself that was the end. Instead, I put it on a high shelf and visited it like a small confession. Sometimes I would take it down and touch the edges of the paper and feel how fragile memory is when it is no longer new. Oh, people ask me now if I regret keeping her. They ask if forgiveness makes you weak. I tell them the truth I have learned. Forgiveness is an active ledger. It is not erasure. It is the decision to continue bearing witness to someone you have loved enough to catalog. My sister did try to steal my husband. She did not know the secret he had kept. That secret was that he had been uncertain and afraid, and that he had chosen to document his fear rather than act on it blindly. The secret did not absolve him. The secret did not villainize her any less. It simply made the landscape of our hurt readable. There are no final acts in ordinary lives. There are only smaller endings and the daily courage to show up again. We showed up. We spoke. We kept records not as weapons, but as maps. We learned to be clearer. We learned to say the small phrases that keep houses from tipping. Sometimes, late, when the house is quiet, I take the shoebox down and touch the corner of a photograph, and I remember how fragile we all are. I remember the way secrets can either become chains or keys, depending on who holds them and why. I remember that the person I married is also the person who can be afraid, and the person who can also choose to be honest in the end. It is not a heroic story. It is a domestic one. It is a story of slow repair and of a secret that, by being revealed, allowed something honest to begin again. She left, but not like a slammed door. She left like a window eased open to let air move through a room that had been stuffy too long. She packed slowly, as if she were learning how to fold apology into tissue paper. I watched from the kitchen and made tea. The boxes were labeled with the neutral precision of someone trying not to hurt. Clothes, one read in my handwriting before I corrected it. Books, another. Her possessions felt smaller when measured against the weight of what had happened. She placed a single mug, the one with a chip on the rim, into a box and held it as if it were a relic. I let her take it. She asked if she could come back to visit for the holidays. Her voice had the timidity of someone requesting permission to breathe in a room that once belonged to them. I said nothing for a long time. "We'll see," I said finally, which was not a denial and not an embrace. The first few nights without her in the house were quiet in the way that clears the throat before speaking. There were practical adjustments, 2 fewer plates, 1 fewer toothbrush holder, and there were textures of absence that required naming. My husband set the study back to the way it had been. He removed the framed photograph and put it in a drawer. He began sleeping in the bed that felt like ours again, though sometimes he woke in the middle of the night with the shape of someone else on his side of the mattress. We started therapy because it seemed a better commitment than a promise. The therapist had a way of saying small things that landed like tools. "Tell me the truth you can live with," she suggested once, and we both blinked as if truth had been an object we had misplaced. He learned to speak the map of his feelings without coloring in the regions he feared. I learned to say, "I am afraid," and to mean it without turning the admission into an accusation. Therapy is mostly repetition. It is practice in saying the same honest, small sentence until it stops feeling like a splinter and becomes a plank. We learned to keep to rituals that made the house legible again. He would text me when he was late. I would tell him when I felt unsettled. We set a soft rule not to talk about the past like it was a weapon. We decided to use questions like ladders, not hammers. She called sometimes, haltingly. She asked about recipes and birthdays. I answered with a politeness that was newly calibrated, neither kinship's old, easy surrender, nor the coldness of a closed account. Once she asked how he was. Better, I said. Still learning to stay, I might have added, but I did not. When we met again, for a talk that the therapist helped moderate, she wore a scarf the color of apology. She said the words people expect. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I was lonely. There were small explanations that begged for sympathy. A divorce that had not yet happened to her. Money troubles, nights of drinking. She spoke of wanting to feel known. She did not speak of entitlement. She spoke of hunger. We were all hungry in different ways. She had been hungry for attention and for a version of herself that felt loved. He had been hungry for certainty and for the permission to be human when his internal compass failed. I had been hungry for steadiness and for the small daily agreements that make a shared life possible. Recognizing hunger is not justification, but it becomes a map you can use to find one another if you choose. We kept the recordings for a while in the top of a drawer like theological texts, dangerous, heavy, to be read only when necessary. Sometimes I would take them out and listen at night with the volume low, not to find fault, but to understand cadence. I learned that confessions, when played back, often sound smaller than the panic that birthed them. There was, in most of the recordings, a tiredness that made me pity the speaker and also steel me. It is possible to pity and to protect at once. Outside of us, people picked sides the way weather picks landscapes. Some relatives assumed I would divorce. Others suggested we had one foot in the grave and the other in foolishness. Friends who had been silent now offered opinions like spoons of salt. We learned to accept advice lightly and do the harder work of deciding for ourselves. The world is eager for neat endings. Life prefers economies that are messy. There were moments when I wanted the theatrical release of wrath. I imagined public scenes where truth would be flung like acid and the ugliness would have the cleansing heat of a play. I pictured viral confessions and triumphant exits. For a breath, I longed for spectacle. Then practicality returned like a cool tide. Practicality asks quieter questions. How do we feed the cat? Who will pick up the car? What about taxes? We rebuilt trust brick by small brick. He attended sessions alone and with me. He closed his social accounts for a time to reduce the temptation of private theaters. He met with a counselor who taught him to name temptation before it turned into action. He learned that confession without repair is just an airing of guilt. Repair requires concrete choices repeated until they become habit. I made lists of small things that mattered. A shared calendar that both of us edited. A password exchange for mundane accounts so secrecy could not breed suspicion. A nightly question, "What did you notice today?" The question is dull and domestic, and therein lies its genius. It fosters attention the way watering fosters growth. Forgiveness arrived like small measures of light. It did not descend as a sudden miracle. It arrived as the accumulation of unremarkable days where promises were kept. He started to leave notes in my lunchbox again, tiny folded rectangles that read, "Good luck," or "Call me when you're free." I kept one in my wallet for months like a relic. We developed a language of small reparation, a text, a call, a hand on the small of the back. Occasionally, the past lunged like a stray animal. My chest would clamp and my hands would make a fist. I would go to the drawer and touch the shoebox to remind myself that the archive existed and that I had chosen containment over release. He would notice my silence and name it. He would say, "I'm here," and sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it was not. Months turned into a year of small experiments. We tried a weekend trip that was not about checking boxes, but about being present together. We packed a picnic and drove until the city slurred into hills. He forgot his phone in the glove compartment, and for 3 hours we were a two-person island of conversations without screens. We spoke of books and of the color of the sky. We spoke of fears we had never named because naming them made them seem more manageable. She began therapy and sent me a message once, an uncertain olive branch. "Thank you," she wrote. "I'm learning." The message was brief and sincere. She did not ask to return. She sent a picture of a plant she had started to keep. There were afternoons when the house hummed with an ordinary joy I had not trusted in months. He would make a casserole and burn the edges in the way he always had. I would complain, and he would laugh, that small, private laugh that used to be our shared currency. We learned to laugh at small failures again. Laughter returned, soft and cautious at first, then more confident. Not everything healed. There were still nights when I would wake up with the shape of betrayal in my chest. Whoa, there were family gatherings where people asked awkward questions, and my jaw clenched in the half-smile of someone practicing composure. My sister and I were not friends as before. We existed in a new economy of interaction, polite, distanced, careful. She visited sometimes to drop off a casserole and left without lingering. Those visits felt like testing the temperature of water before entering. Time does something generous. It makes what was sharp grow duller around the edges. It does not erase, it erodes. Memory loses resolution the way an old photograph fades. We began to measure ourselves not by a single catastrophe, but by the series of small recoveries that followed. He returned a key I had asked for months earlier, an act tiny enough to be mundane, and I felt a wave of relief that surprised me with its intensity. People asked whether I forgave. I answered that forgiveness is not a switch, but a ledger, entries made and tallied over time. I told them it felt like learning to trust the weather. You notice patterns, you see small consistencies that tell you whether rain is likely. Trust, I learned, is less a faith than an accumulation of evidence. It is the daily deposits of attention and honesty that eventually pay off. There were small gestures that mattered more than grand speeches. He started leaving a glass of water beside my bed when I was ill. He would bring me coffee in the exact way I liked it without being asked. He learned the art of anticipating a need and meeting it. Anticipation is a language of care. Oh, I noticed. On a quiet afternoon, months after the revelation, she came by with a plant wrapped in brown paper. "For your kitchen," she said. She handed it to me with hands that trembled less than they had before. I took it. We stood in the doorway and for a moment did not name the awkwardness. Then she said simply, "Thank you for letting me live here, even for a little while." I said, "Take care," which felt like a benediction that matched the modesty of the exchange. The plant flourished on the sill. I watered it on schedule and sometimes whispered about inconsequential things as I tended it. It became an emblem of small, living repairs. When I pass it, I sometimes think of that shoebox and the way we had chosen documentation over drama. I think of ledger entries and of the slow arithmetic of trust. We never pretended nothing had happened. The wound was acknowledged and enumerated and tended. Sometimes healing involves tidy acts, and sometimes it involves untidy ones, a late-night argument, a forgotten anniversary, a sudden panic that turns an ordinary day into a testing ground. We failed sometimes. We apologized more than once for things that felt too small to mention and also too large to ignore. The apologies were freighted with the ordinary courage of two people deciding to remain in an imperfect house. Years later, when friends asked whether our marriage was stronger, I would say, different. Strong implies a certainty we could not claim. Different acknowledges that we had reconfigured our lives around fresh awareness. We were more attentive, not always less afraid. We had learned to speak when ambiguity came like a fog. We had learned to catalog quietly and compassionately, to keep records not as weapons but as maps. Sometimes I would walk past the high shelf and take down the shoebox and feel the weight of the past in my hands. I would open it and touch the edges of paper, the small, brittle napkin with the lipstick stain, the voice notes like fossilized breath. I would put them back and notice how, through proximity, the wounds had become less jagged. I would remember that secrecy can be a prison and also a shield, depending on who holds it and why. I would remember that my husband had chosen a strange and careful form of honesty, one mediated by devices and notes, because he feared acting without knowing himself. Forgiveness did not absolve mistakes. It reframed them as parts of a larger, continuing work. We were not the kind of couple whose story ended in a single, cathartic scene. We were the kind who learned that small, habitual kindness is a form of loyalty. We learned to offer witness to one another without weaponizing history. We learned to keep each other's secrets only insofar as they did not conceal harm. My sister and I never returned to the closeness we once had. We had become intimates of a different sort, acquaintances who shared a family tree and a cautious civility. She remarried years later to someone who lived in another city and called sometimes on Sundays. The calls were awkward at first, and then, with time, they smoothed into a rhythm that did not demand the old warmth. She sent photos of her children and occasional holiday cookies. I responded with small notes and recipes. What remained was the ordinary domesticity of two people who had chosen, stubbornly, to remain. We celebrated birthdays, we argued about which show to watch. We honored quiet rituals, washing the dishes together, taking the dog out at dusk, saying good night out loud even when both of us felt worn. There was no grand forgiveness so much as a steadying of the ship. We learned to check our course daily and correct when necessary. Sometimes the secret sat like a stone in my pocket. I could take it out and examine it, and then choose whether to hold it or to lay it down. The secret had been a tool. If wielded well, it helped us see the shape of our hurt. If wielded poorly, it would have become an instrument of destruction. We chose repair. We chose to be small, steady, and unglamorous in our mending. In the end, I learned that love is both fragile and stubborn. It breaks easily. It rebuilds slowly. It requires inventory and accounting and the courage to admit when one is wrong. It requires also the mercy to accept apologies that are imperfect and to witness change that is uneven. My sister did try to steal my husband. She did not know the secret he had kept. That secret, his ledger of doubt, did not make the hurt vanish. It did, however, allow a kind of reading of the wound that made repair possible. We keep living, and the house keeps learning to be a home again. Sometimes the past appears in the corner of an evening, a flash like a photograph, but most nights we fall asleep like ordinary people, with a match of small comforts and a sense that, however provisional, we are still choosing one another. That is not a tidy hero's ending. It is simpler and harder. The decision to remain in a shared, imperfect life and to make small, honest acts that, over time, become the architecture of trust.